to learn about Stalin and totalitarianism in Russia. And this is the PowerPoint that if you love Russian propaganda, this is the PowerPoint for you. Okay, so to review, let's talk a little bit about the Civil War. So as we know, the Civil War is fought between the Red Army, and that's going to be our Bolsheviks, our workers, our proletariat, the working class to the lower class, and the White Army. And these are going to be the people that are loyal to the government, so people who want Tsar Nicholas to be reinstated, people who are of the wealthy class, who want to kind of maintain that social hierarchy, and people who just generally support capitalism because they're benefiting from it. But as we know, the Red Army, they're going to win, which means the communists are going to stay in power and turn Russia into a Soviet state. So that's our Civil War. The other thing to remember about the Civil War is that this has been terrible for Russia. So as we know, during World War I, Russia is sending all the resources to the front lines. They're doing terribly in the war. They're losing constantly. People are mutinying. People are dying. It's pretty terrible. Meanwhile, back at home, everyone's starving because all the resources are being sent to the front lines. So as soon as they get out of that war, Lenin promises them peace, land, and bread. So once they get out of the war, they immediately come into this civil war, which now, once again, resources are being sent to the front lines, people are starving, it's really terrible. So by finally 1921, 1922, when the Civil War finally ends and war is finally over for Russia, it's been almost 8 years now of just nonstop war for them. It's pretty terrible, as you can imagine. So the industrial output is pretty much dead. There's a terrible drought that occurs, which means all the farmers aren't able to produce as much food. There's terrible famine. It's really bad for Russia. So Lenin, who's now head of the government, he's looking at this terrible economy, looking at people starving, he's realizing he needs to do something. He cannot just institute this wonderful communism in which there's no private ownership and everyone shares equally. That's not going to work because people don't have anything to share. So he institutes this policy called New Economic Policy. And it's basically modified capitalism, so allowing a little bit of private ownership. What this means is peasants are allowed to sell their production. They're allowed to sell what they're growing. Small businesses are allowed to exist, so people are able to maintain some wealth, and once people have wealth, then they're able to spend money and support other people and kind of get the economy back on track. However, major industries, the things that the government is working for, things that are affecting people on a massive scale, these are still controlled by the government. So it's basically kind of like socialism. What is the result of this new economic policy? Within a year, within a couple of years, the economy has been revived. So it's very beneficial. Lenin is able to bring some stability to the Russian people after years and years of war and strife. Lenin also is going to turn Russia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, which it will remain until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses, but that's a story for another day. So what happens? Lenin and the communists are formally going to create this Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's meant to be a communist state, and as we know from Marx, true communism means that there is no government. So already this is problematic, because what Lenin actually creates is a one-party state, and that one party is the Communist Party. So Lenin is at the top. We have this new elite, which is essentially a group of bureaucrats, part of the Communist Party, and they're running the show. It's basically like a new aristocracy. These are the people that have good jobs, they have wealth, they have food, they have nice houses. They're the ones that are really benefiting from this. So essentially what we see is the aristocracy under Tsar Nicholas have now been replaced by this bureaucratic elite under Lenin. Kind of the same story, different names. But really, you have the hierarchy with the few at the top benefiting and the majority of people still relatively suffering. Lenin is going to die in 1924. Unexpectedly, no one really anticipated this, least of all Lenin. And when he dies, it creates a power vacuum because people weren't anticipating him dying for many more years, decades. They didn't really have a succession in place. So it creates this power vacuum in the Politburo, which is essentially the executive committee of the Communist Party. It's a fancy word for basically the people who run the Communist Party. So they are now stuck with having to look for a replacement leader. This is also ironic if you think about the sense that this is supposed to be a collective leadership, so you're not really supposed to have a leader, but now that Lenin's dead, they're looking for a leader. It's kind of strange. And as you can see from these pictures, when Lenin dies, it's massive. The cult of Lenin is something that's been established in Russia. There's so much propaganda, there's so much indoctrination about how Lenin is the one true leader, the ultimate leader. So when he dies, people literally line up for miles in the cold. You can see from this picture, it does not look very pleasant. But what do they line up for? They line up for to pay their respects to Lenin. And his body is actually still entombed, it's embalmed under glass case. We see this with various other totalitarian dictators. It's a way to kind of continue their cult even after they die. But back to what happens actually in 1924. So after Lenin dies, this power vacuum creates, and we really see two political rivals emerge. And that's going to be Leon Trotsky, who we've heard about before, and Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel. Let's talk about Trotsky. Trotsky was an army leader. He was actually the leader of the Red Army, so he's pretty instrumental in winning the Civil War for the communists. So a lot of people really like him. He's supported by the people on the left, and these people, they want to end the new economic policy that Lenin had because these are the hardcore Bolsheviks. So they want to get rid of any aspect of capitalism, any aspect of private ownership. They're all about having that massive revolution. They want to spread the revolution around the world. They want the entire globe to be communist and just continue the revolution. They also want Russia to industrialize rapidly, which just entirely makes sense with their communist goals. But this is essentially what the left are leaning towards. And they basically picked Trotsky to be their man. And then we see him leading some people. And I'm pretty sure a doctored image of him looking like he's poking Stalin in the ear. I doubt that actually happened. Speaking of Stalin, he is supported by the party on the right. And Stalin has actually been quietly working his way up through the party for some time now. So under Lenin in 1922 or so, he's actually appointed party general secretary, which doesn't seem like that big of a deal. It seems like kind of a weak post. But it's actually super powerful because Stalin is in charge of appointing all the other bureaucrats, which means if anybody wants a good job, a good position, they have to go to Stalin. So Stalin is wielding a lot of power. He's able to use this power and use this goodwill that he's built up for years and years to get in good with the Politburo members who are opposing the left, opposing Trotsky, and he's basically able to convince them that he's their man. So they're going to throw their support behind Stalin, and Stalin is ultimately going to be able to take over. So in 1928, 4 years after Lenin dies, Stalin officially is in control of the Communist Party. And he immediately forces rival Leon Trotsky into exile. Trotsky actually ends up in Mexico, and in, I believe, 1940 or so, he's murdered with an ice pick. This guy takes him out in a Mexican bar, ice pick literally to the head. So, what does this tell us? You don't want to get on the bad side of Stalin, because it does not end well for you. So that's what happened to Trotsky. What happens to all the people who supported Trotsky? Well, within a year, they've all been eliminated. Many of them have been sent to work camps, to what will become gulags. Many of them have mysteriously been disposed of, i.e. Stalin's had them murdered, which is something we'll see again and again. So what does this mean for Stalin? By 1929, he's eliminated a large part of his opposition, and he can essentially call himself a dictator. Although he would never say that because he is the true leader of the Soviet Union, and he's doing all this for the Soviet Union's good. I don't know if you agree with that. I definitely find that very questionable. So that's what's happening with Stalin. Now that he's in power, he realizes he needs to industrialize the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had modernized, it had industrialized, as we know, during the 19th and early 20th century, but then all the wars that they participated in kind of derailed that. So his first goal is to industrialize and increase the industrial output. He looks at what's happening in Europe, he looks at America, and he wants to compete. He wants the Soviet Union to be a global power. His other main goal is to eradicate any threats to his dictatorship, to his power. So anyone who might challenge his control is removed. And where do they go? They go to the gulags, which are the work camps. They go to prisons. They are removed and never heard from again, i.e. they are murdered. It's pretty bad. You don't want to be on Stalin's bad side. And we're going to see this theme again and again and again every time we talk about Stalin. Despite the fact that he looks so nice there hanging out with those kids. Little kid with his toy plane, hanging out with the kid playing the violin. Doesn't he look nice? He wouldn't want to kill anyone. Oh, that's Stalin. All right. What do we call this type of government? Because this is not just a dictatorship. This is not just an autocracy. So it's not like just what we talked about under the czars. This is a new type of government. This type of government is totalitarianism. And I promise by the end of the semester, by the end of this unit, you're going to be really comfortable with this word, totalitarianism. You guys try to say it. It's fun. So what does this mean? This is a government that takes complete and central total control over every aspect of a person's public and private life. So it's not just saying where you're going to work and where you're going to live. It really is so much deeper. People are indoctrinated. They're brainwashed under totalitarianism. They have very little freedom. This is the complete opposite of where we've seen society going. This is the complete opposite of the Enlightenment and all those ideas of progress that we saw in the 19th century. So the ideas of reason, freedom, human dignity, and the worth of an individual are completely eradicated. There are no individuals. You are not a person. You are a member of the Soviet state. You are a member of Stalin's government. More than you are a person, more than you are a brother, a son, a wife, a mother. Beyond all that, before you define yourself as an individual, you are a member of the state. And that is truly totalitarianism in a nutshell. But let's talk about it a little bit more. What are some traits of totalitarianism? Some we're a little familiar with. We've talked about a little bit. Think about World War I. But one of the biggest traits of totalitarianism is indoctrination. And indoctrination is essentially brainwashing. It's where you hear ideas over and over and over and over again to the point where you become desensitized to them and you don't question them any longer. They become part of your thought process. So I always use the example of what if I told you that I was the best teacher excuse me, at Mills High School. And that's fine if I just told you that. But what if your other teachers told you that? What if your parents told you that? What if your friends? What if you saw it on Twitter and on Tumblr and you were Snapchatting about it? After a while, you would not even thinking about it. You would just say, oh yeah, Ms. Dove, she's the best teacher at Mills High School. And you wouldn't even question it any longer because you've been brainwashed. And this is essentially what happened to people under Stalin. They were overwhelmed. They were inundated with images and propaganda and constant references to how wonderful Stalin was that there became a sense that people didn't even question him. He was the true leader. And this is very similar to what we see in countries like North Korea. This is why we have such a giant cult of Kim Jong-un. In addition to the propaganda and the indoctrination, there's also a sense of censorship, which means that any anti-Stalin information, legitimate or not, is not allowed to be expressed to the public. So people don't have access to other ideas. So really it's one-sided stories. And there's also a sense of terror that people who might question oftentimes end up going to the gulags, end up going to prison, end up dead. So there's really a fear you don't speak out, because if you speak out, you could get in trouble getting hurt. So what does this look like? We see constant displays of nationalism. There are parades, there are rallies, there are posters everywhere, of which you're seeing so many wonderful examples in this propaganda. In this presentation. The government controls the media. So at this point, all the newspapers, the radio, the television, it's all controlled by the government, and it's all telling one side of the story. And as I said, anyone who opposes Stalin is removed, sometimes very insidiously and secretly, but oftentimes very publicly. That this is a way to show people you don't want to say something bad against Stalin, because what happens to those people? They get hurt. In addition, there's a religious persecution. I think that's something important to note. Russia has historically been a very religious country, and to this day, the Russian Orthodox Church is very powerful and very important for people's lives. But under the Soviet state, there was technically no religion allowed. The police are literally destroying the churches, destroying the synagogues, or if they allow them to stand, they would turn them into government buildings. And I'll tell you, when I was actually in St. Petersburg, there were many churches that had been government buildings, but previously been churches, and then following the fall of communism, then were able to be returned to becoming churches. So churches are replaced, religious leaders are persecuted, oftentimes they're exiled, and in its place, instead of having this religious entity, religious belief, instead of having this time to go to church and, you know, acknowledge God and et cetera, it's all replaced by the cult of Stalin. And literally there are posters of Stalin everywhere. There he looks so happy with those children. They look so happy to look at Stalin and their cult of him. So that's what's happening with religious persecution. So I've mentioned a little bit about people who oppose Stalin and what happened to them. This is not a secret event. In fact, this event is called the Great Purge. So what happens is all the Bolsheviks who participated in the revolution, who were not totally on Stalin's side, were targeted, which basically means almost every leader in his government at some point are going to be arrested. They're charged with committing crimes against the Soviet state, which basically is a blanket statement for if you got on Stalin's bad side, now you're committing crimes against the Soviet state. It's that sense of if you're not with us, you're automatically against us. And a lot of these Bolsheviks are placed on show trials, which are public trials of those charged with these crimes. Why would they do this? Because they wanted to make a point. They wanted to inspire fear in citizens. Because if you are watching TV, if you are listening to the radio and you're hearing people, some people that you might know, who you know are good people, and you hear them committing to these false crimes or being falsed into some sort of expression of guilt, and then hearing the terrible punishments, going to the workhouses, going to the prisons, going to the gulags, going to death, it's going to inspire a lot of fear in you. And you're going to be scared. You don't want to misstep. The biggest result of this is that 8 to 13 million Russians die during this time, which is a massive amount of people that are charged with committing crimes against the Soviet state. In your textbook, it mentions a woman who's sent to the gulags, who is sent because she was caught praying and therefore charged with a crime against the Soviet state. So something as innocuous as saying a prayer and your neighbor reporting on you could get you sent to these gulags and to these prisons. It's really super intense. It's hard to even imagine what it must have been like at that time. So let's talk a little bit about the economy and what Stalin's doing there. So we've talked about his goals to industrialize the Soviet Union. So how does he do this? So first of all, he's going to get rid of the new economic policy. Instead, he's going to turn this into a command economy. And command economy is kind of a fancy word for what we kind of consider communism to this day. And it's basically an economy that's controlled by the government. The government commands what the economy does. What does this mean? How does this look? We see this that workers' freedoms have now been limited. There are actual outright laws, which means that workers have very little say in what type of jobs they have available to them. Some workers have very little say in where they live, in what kind of jobs that they are able to do. They're definitely not allowed to form unions. There's very little protection of workers' rights. And instead, workers basically have to follow the party line. And what do you think might happen to those who don't? You're right, they're going to go to the gulag, the prison, or death. In addition to this kind of fear that you must follow along, there's also the constant refrain of propaganda and indoctrination. So there are posters everywhere. You're hearing it on the radio. There's constant refrains. Sacrifice, increase production, do this for the Soviet state. Because you're not just a worker, you're not just a person, you are part of the Soviet state. And you need to be a good worker, a good citizen. And a good citizen sacrifices themselves for the greater good. So it's kind of this twin pressure of fear that you don't want to be hurt, but also there's this belief in yourself that you are part of the Soviet state and therefore you need to be a good part of it and support the Soviet state. We see this also in Stalin's 5-year plan. So Stalin has a couple 5-year plans. We're going to see this also with Mao and Communist China a couple decades down the road. But what happens is Stalin basically says, look, in 5 years, by 1933, we're going to have massive industrial growth. We're going to build up our military. We're going to have huge quotas of steel, coal, oil, electricity. We're going to do all these wonderful things. And we're going to do it in 5 years. They are impossibly high quotas. It's hard to actually accomplish this. But they're actually able to do so. But what do? They do it at the expense of the people. So instead of producing consumer goods, so goods for people to use in their daily lives, all the focus, all the output goes towards these industrial goods instead. So instead of goods that people could use for their daily lives. Now we see it in the steel, the coal, the oil, the electricity. So they are able to achieve their goals. So Stalin's very proud of this. But who is it at the expense of? Expense of the people. But can you complain under Stalin's totalitarian state? Of course not, because if you complain, now you are going against the Soviet state, and that means that you are going to potentially go to the gulags, go to the workhouses, go to death. And also, you've been indoctrinated. A good citizen doesn't complain. This is your sacrifice for the Soviet state. So again, we see this twin belief. It's this twin emphasis on mentally supporting the state. Stalin is also going to look at the agriculture. And as we've mentioned, Russia has primarily been an agriculture society. We have millions of private farms. And Stalin is going to revolutionize them. What is he going to do? He's going to turn all these private farms. He's going to say, instead of having all these tiny private farms, now we're going to have massive, huge collective farms. So he's going to take 26 million private farms that are spread out across Russia and turn them into 250,000 collective farms. These collective farms are acres and acres. Some of them are 20,000 acres big. And everybody is working on these farms together. They're living on the farms. There's very little private life on these farms. And it's obviously not very ideal. So as you can imagine, many people who have now had their farms taken from them are now being told that they live on this communal farm do not appreciate this. So many people revolt. So we have a group of peasants that revolt by destroying the crops and their livestock. So they'd rather burn their fields than be part of these collective farms. Any guesses what's going to happen to them? Of course you're right. They're forced to work to the threat of death. And in fact, many of them are just outright murdered. So it's pretty terrible. 5 to 10 million peasants at this time are killed. Millions more are sent to Siberia, which is where we see the gulags. And the gulags, as I've said, are basically the prison houses, the working prisons where people are forced to break rocks kind of until they die. It's pretty terrible. You do not want to go to a gulag. There's also another group of peasants who really oppose this, and they're known as the kulaks. They're the wealthier peasants. So these are people who have slightly larger farms, more wealth, more to lose by being forced to work on a collective farm. They revolt, and their entire class is wiped out. So that's really terrible. In addition to this, another way to basically cow people into following in line and going along with his plans, it turns out that there's actually a government-sponsored famine. So because the government owns all the resources and all the productions of goods, the government is also in charge of distributing these goods and distributing the food and distributing all the things that people need to live. So the government actually holds back and starves people, primarily the people who are opposing, the people who are not falling in line. And it turns out that about 10 million peasants are actually starved at this time. So we see tens of millions of people dying under this agricultural revolution. We saw 8 to 13 million people die during these show trials in the Great Purge. So Stalin is murdering people by the millions, tens of millions. I think Stalin had a quote that said, "One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." So you can see how cold he is to this, because his job, his main goal, is to maintain control of this state and eliminate any opposition. And many times this elimination is incredibly brutal. It's hard to even imagine the massive amount of death and devastation that Stalin is responsible for. We talk about terrible people, and I think we all kind of assume that Hitler is the worst dictator in history because the Holocaust was so inhumane. But I posit that Stalin, I think, was potentially worse, just by the massive amount of death that he caused. It's incredibly terrible. So to wrap up, where does this leave us? A lot of death and devastation, unfortunately. So what does this mean for the Soviet Union? Within 10 years, so by the late 1930s, wheat production is doubled due to collective farming. They're very successful by this, because if you are not working basically yourself to the bone, you're probably going to die. Electrical production is up 800%. So Stalin's able to bring electricity to millions of his people. Steel production increases from 4 to 18 million metric tons. So it increases by, what's that, 400%, something like that. one of you math people, you could figure that out for me. So we're seeing a lot of industrial output. So Russia's industrializing incredibly rapidly. It becomes a major industrial power. As we'll see in World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union, is able to be a massive player in this war, and following the war is basically one of the most powerful nations in the world. And it's because of these 5-year plans that Stalin has implemented. It's because of the agricultural revolution that Stalin is responsible for. He's able to really turn Russia from this large agricultural country that had some industrial output but was really suffering due to World War I and suffering due to the Civil War, and really turn it around. But at whose expense? And that's really important to remember, always at whose expense. So the end result for this, the Soviet Union is not a communist state. This is not the communism that Marx had dreamt of. This is certainly not the communism that Lenin is thinking of. Instead, this is something entirely different. This is a totalitarian dictatorship. It's incredibly industrially strong, as we've seen, huge industrial output. It's a dramatically centralized state. All the power rests really with one, and that is Stalin. And then tangentially with the bureaucrats that Stalin has closest to him. Who's paying the price for these industrial gains? The people, largely the people. The cult of Stalin is everywhere due to the indoctrination, the propaganda, the censorship, and of course Stalin removing all potential threats and enemies. And that's where I'm going to leave you with today. So what have we learned from this wonderful PowerPoint that I produced for you? We've seen the changes that Stalin is responsible for. We've seen the growth that Russia has experienced. The Soviet Union has gone from being this large agricultural country to this incredibly powerful, incredibly industrial country. But more importantly, we've seen that they've gone from being under an autocratic czarist regime to this totalitarian dictatorship where people have very limited to no freedoms, that they have very little choice in their lives, and there's very little to no ability to question the government, because questioning the government puts you in a very difficult position in that you are either going to be exiled, you're going to be sent to the gulags, or worse. So there's an incredible amount of fear coupled with this massive indoctrination, this massive brainwashing, that people cannot escape their belief in Stalin. And that's where I'm going to leave you with today. So, thank you.